that, let me introduce our speaker today. Linda Nagel is a silviculturalist with the Michigan Technology University, there of the School of Forest Resources and Environmental Science. Linda?
Great, thank you, Bob. And the sound is okay? Everybody can hear me? Okay, great. All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending today's webinar. There's more people on the East Coast, so most of you are still in the morning, so good morning and good afternoon to those in the East. We'll move to the first slide. Today's seminar, I'll be talking a little bit about climate change, giving you an overview. I'll discuss the role of terrestrial ecosystems and what can we do as forest managers. I'll spend most of the time on today's seminar on this particular question. And as part of that, I'll go through an adaptive silviculture planning process and then tell you about a current project that we have collaboratively across the country. And on my title slide, I had 3 co-authors there, Chris Swanston, Maria Genoviak, and Matt Powers, and I want to recognize those folks as people who are contributing to a lot of the work that you'll see in this presentation. Okay, so climate change. We're going to start with a polling question here as well. So the question is, which answer best describes your belief in and concern about global warming? Okay, we see the results there. So the majority of you chose concerned, a few of you chose alarmed, and then a decreasing number in cautious, doubtful, and dismissive. And these results are a little bit different. This is a different audience, but this question comes from a study done by Yale and George Mason universities where they conclude that there are 6 Americas with different belief systems, and the general population shows less concern and less alarmed concern over climate change than you folks. So that's an interesting result. So with climate change, this isn't a climate science talk, but to set the stage, the shorter amount of time we look back in history, the greater the rate of temperature increase, and there's sort of indisputable evidence about this trajectory. And it's a good reminder to us to remember that this change in temperature over time has a seasonality effect to it. And so the changes that we're seeing globally vary depending on what part of the world you're in. There are some factors that affect the uncertainty surrounding climate change. There's uncertainty in the public eye as to whether climate change is actually happening or not, but the scientific uncertainty is really influenced by 2 things, and that is human behavior, so how much future emissions there will be into the atmosphere, and the second one is from modeling. And this particular diagram shows how scientists deal with some of that uncertainty. And they look at future climate predictions that are generated using a variety of different scenarios. And in this particular example here from the IPCC report, we see that let's see, you can see the highlighter there. This is the high emissions, or the most pessimistic and probably the most realistic scenario. And on the lower left-hand side here, we've got the lower emissions and the most optimistic scenario. And we can use this information to look at projected changes in climate over time. And if we look at this unit here, that represents the highest amount of change, and this one here represents the lowest amount of change. So if you're a forest manager or natural resource manager, this is a useful way to look at projected climate change because you're working within this range, this potential range of future conditions. So why does climate change matter? This picture over here is from Bayfield, Wisconsin on Lake Superior, and the ice in that particular bay is on that lake, in that bay, 20 to 45 days shorter than in the past. So this has implications not only ecologically, but also from the standpoint of recreation and the economy. Canada geese are arriving 29 days earlier. Songbirds are migrating on average 6 miles further north every year. And then we have these obvious effects on the ecology. There's already stress in our forest ecosystems, and climate change adds an additional stress, and it adds compounding disturbances, and we know that climate change will influence the severity and extent of those disturbances. So let's talk about the role of terrestrial ecosystems. So there are some potential benefits of climate change. Some of those benefits include increased productivity through longer growing seasons, and there's some evidence of phenological shifts that supports this. Increased precipitation in some regions. The trend seems to be wet areas are getting wetter and dry areas are getting drier. CO2 fertilization, so increasing photosynthesis by decreasing the amount of water that is lost for CO2 that is brought into a leaf, which can increase potential productivity. And increasing foraging and volcanism, and this can have potentially positive impacts on species such as the Carner blue butterfly, which is a federally listed endangered species, and if it can increase the number of life cycles it can complete in a given year, that could have a positive impact on that population of that particular species. However, the number of stresses are much higher than the number of potential benefits from climate change. It's thought that the fertilization effect of CO2 may be transitory and that photosynthesis will not remain elevated into the future. Extreme weather events, and we're all very familiar with extreme weather events, not only nationally but also globally, and the impact that they have economically and ecologically. We can look at a trend of seasonal drought. And here, this is the most recent one from NOAA. It shows a very large portion of the country still under persistent drought and some improvement across the midsection of the country. Longer growing seasons. This can be a positive, but it can also really change the hydrological cycle and add an additional stress to forest ecosystems. Expanded pest and disease ranges. This is something most natural resource managers are having to confront right now. One example is with mountain pine beetle, where we've got a picture here from the Helena National Forest and the Black Hills National Forest showing widespread mountain pine beetle impact, and the lower right is a picture of the mountain pine beetle distribution. And we're concerned about this up in the Great Lakes region because lodgepole pine and jack pine meet and hybridize in Canada, and so the concern is the possibility of mountain pine beetle carrying across those two species distributions and possibly affecting eastern forests. Another increased stress is decreased snowpack and early thaw. Again, that affects the hydrological cycle, but also has potential damaging effects to plants. Increased frequency and intensity of fire. So this is also affected by the timing of snowmelt, and we've got two pictures here on the left. These are pictures from the Duck Lake fire in the eastern upper peninsula of Michigan. I'm sorry, this should be May 2012, not 2013. But this is a 21,000 acre fire, which is a pretty sizable fire for this region, and the second fire of about that size that we've had in the last 5 years. So fire is definitely heavily affected by our climate. Species range shifts. So here we have some output from the tree atlas, and on the left-hand side we've got current forest vegetation distribution, and on the right we've got one of the more pessimistic climate change scenarios. The tree atlas takes features that contribute to a species' current habitat and projects where those similar conditions are likely to occur in the future. So it really is representing potential habitat, not necessarily what's actually going to happen. And with the tree atlas, they modeled 134 species, 66 of which gained in potential habitat and 54 lost at least 10% of their potential habitat. There's a western kind of version of the tree atlas, and here we see projections for ponderosa pine. So the current distribution is on the left, and then there's a best case and a worst case scenario on the right, and we can see a significant change in potential habitat. This is Engelmann spruce, which is more sensitive to those climate changes. The impact here of species shifts due to climate is really increasing stress factors and increasing severity of those stress factors, including temperature, moisture, and competition. And there are also likely going to be complex interactions. There's obviously interactions with forest health, mountain pine beetle, and fire. But there are also other interactions. So here's an example from the Great Lakes region. This represents the prairie forest border in the right-hand, upper right-hand picture. And on the lower left-hand map, it's showing the transition zone between temperate and boreal forests. And there are a lot of interactions, including herbivores such as moose, deer, detritivores, earthworms, along with temperature, and other components of the climate that are expected to contribute to major shifts in the vegetation. So we can take a look at key vulnerabilities. This is an example list from the Midwest region, and we can see that many ecosystem characteristics such as low diversity, species that are already in decline, fragmented ecosystems are listed as having high vulnerability. There's also going to be significant impacts on wildlife, on watersheds, on recreation and cultural connections, and this is not an exhaustive list from the 2 citations that are listed on the bottom there. And we're often working under the theory that one major way to accommodate change is to focus on diversity and complexity in our ecosystems. And many people believe that this will be key to maintaining ecosystem function, even if the species mix of the system changes. So here's a list of components that can be enhanced or focused on within our management. So species that are currently increasing, wide range of ecological tolerances, adapted to warmer and drier climates and disturbances. So these are some concepts that we can utilize and bring into the way we make forest management decisions. One way to explain this concept is to take a look at silvicultural systems. This is a diagram that's from the Critique of Silviculture book that Klaus Putman and others came out with in 2009. And on the bottom x-axis we have time, and on the y we have ecosystem characteristics. So if we take a look at, for instance, an even-age single-species plantation, we've got a particular trajectory that we're expecting that stand to take. And there is a limited amount of complexity, which will limit the resiliency of that particular stand. And there's also a narrow window of desired future conditions, which is marked by the size of this circle here. And that gives us a limited adaptive capacity within that management style. If we look at single tree selection, well, we can say that there's greater complexity, so there may be greater resiliency in that system, but we still have a very narrow range of desired future conditions, which limits the adaptive capacity of using that silvicultural system as well. With natural stand development, we typically have more complex or more adaptive systems that can develop. There's a wider range of potential developmental pathways in stand structures that are possible, and this results in greater resilience and potentially greater adaptive capacity. So complexity provides options for the future with uncertainty. And this allows us to manage risk and to respond to this risk with management by incorporating complexity into our silvicultural prescriptions. And I'll give some examples of that a little bit later on. So this really brings us to this very specific question. What can be done during the course of active management on public and private lands that would increase the resistance and resilience of forest stands within the context of climate change? And I want to just revisit the silviculture prescription writing process, which is very similar to a planning framework that I'll cover here in a few minutes. And what I want to focus on first is this section here on desired future conditions. So this is where we're developing a target stand structure in relationship to the identified objectives for that land. And a desired future condition can be defined as a description of the land or resource conditions that are believed necessary if goals and objectives are fully achieved. So here's our second polling question. So everybody needs to wake up now. The question is, when managing forests in your region, desired future conditions are often defined by some type of historic structure and or species composition. Okay, so the biggest response there is A, true. So most of you answered that yes, a desired future condition is defined by some type of historic structure. I realize this is a difficult question for you to answer because with many silvicultural questions, the answer can be it depends. But let's talk about that a little bit. So if indeed we are setting some historic desired future conditions set on a prior condition, such as in this case we've got ponderosa pine, a ponderosa pine forest on the left, and our desired future condition here, this picture on the right represents a 350-year-old very open park-like structure. And if our desired future condition is set to that structure, this represents a climate of the past. And we can start asking ourselves, is this really a useful benchmark in restoration in light of the fact that we know climate is changing in the future? Some other examples of desired future conditions could be, on the left we have a red pine plantation, which is a structure that's very widely distributed across the Great Lakes region. And on the right we have a hardwood stand. So our desired future condition might be restoring back to something that was naturally on that particular site in the past. We might have a northern hardwood stand and we want to maintain that stand. That current structure could be our desired future condition. On the bottom right, this is a picture of a hemlock stand. So maybe we want to incorporate an underrepresented species into our forest or into our stand. So all of those are potential examples of desired future conditions. Let's go back to the example of ponderosa pine. So in this case, we have an even-aged structure on the left and a multi-aged old structure on the right. And if this represents our current and desired future conditions, here this might be business as usual in terms of our restoration or our management style, but it's rigidly attached to a former climate. We know that changing climate conditions will push that original stand on the left along a development trajectory that's different, but we don't necessarily fully understand what that trajectory will be. And if we use this business as usual approach, over time the amount of effort and resources that will be needed and required to maintain that stand within that developmental pathway to get at this structure here on the right that does not include climate change will increase. But if we start thinking about restoring communities appropriate to current or future climate conditions, rather than historic conditions of the past, we can promote concepts of adaptation. And if we promote adaptation toward desired future conditions that are defined in the context of climate change, it will potentially reduce the amount of effort and resources required to maintain our desired outcome. So this brings us to a notion of desired future dynamic processes rather than just a desired future static condition or stand structure. And this notion is very compatible with ideas of restoration. Okay, let's start talking about adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation is defined as actions to moderate the vulnerability of forests to climate change and to position them to be more healthy, resistant, and resilient, and to also facilitate responses to climate change where appropriate. Mitigation is trying to use forests to sequester carbon and provide renewable energy and biomass. And I'm not going to talk about mitigation very much today. We're going to focus mostly on adaptation. So we can talk about adaptation in terms of these R's that we often hear about, and we'll just go through these really quickly. Resistance is improving the defenses of the forest against the effects of change. This is basically maintaining status quo. So we might do this in short-term or high-value situations, plantations perhaps. Maybe there's a high priority for endangered species, fuel breaks in WUI areas, maybe intensive invasive species removal. But with resistance, it's basically paddling upstream. Resilience is accommodating gradual change, but usually returning to a prior condition. This is important, the part about returning to a prior condition. So examples here might be thinning stands to improve health or vigor, or managing vegetation following a disturbance, but we're always trying to manage back to a prior condition. Response is intentionally accommodating change by enabling ecosystems to adaptively respond. So we might assist in transitions or range shifts. And realignment is more heavily disturbed systems, trying to get them in alignment with current or future conditions rather than restoring to a historical baseline. Response and realignment are often combined into a notion of transition, so helping ecosystems transition to a future condition. And then we have reduce, which is more or less a mitigation measure. All of these R's represent silvicultural opportunities, and in many cases may actually represent greater opportunities for active forest management. All right, let's talk about adaptive silviculture planning. Got another polling question here. How does climate change rate as a factor in natural resource management and planning in your region? Okay, we've got our answers. So the most popular answer was C, a minor consideration, followed by B, one of many important considerations. The smallest answer is that it's a priority. And we could do many follow-up questions to this question. Perhaps this is something that's changing in the list of considerations and priorities that you're using to help guide your management. But this is a very interesting result. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a planning approach to incorporating climate change into existing management approaches. And some of you, given the list of folks that have joined the webinar, I know are familiar with some of these approaches. The left-hand diagram, or the left-hand publication is one from the West, Responding to Climate Change in National Forests, a guidebook for developing adaptation options. The resource I'm going to draw from today is on the right, the Forest Adaptation Resources book, Climate Change Tools and Approaches for Land Managers. And this is a planning process that was designed by the Forest Service unit here in Houghton, and was designed and implemented first on the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. And in that workbook, they have this flow chart or diagram of a process that they've outlined, and they call this process the Adaptation Workbook. So what I want to do to describe this is to walk through each of these steps and explain how you might utilize this process in your own management. So the first step in this process is to define your area of interest. And for the sake of this example, let's define our area of interest as the Hiawatha National Forest in the eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And we're going to go to a northern hardwood stand that's dominated by sugar maple and has a minor component of yellow birch, eastern hemlock, American basswood, and eastern white pine. Okay, so that's the first step. That's easy. The second step is to assess climate change impacts and vulnerabilities for the area of interest. And here's where we might use some additional tools. So this publication here in the upper left is an ecosystem vulnerability assessment and synthesis. It's a different document than the one I just showed you. This is a vulnerability assessment that was a companion to the development of the FAR workbook. So this is for northern Wisconsin. There's one here for Washington. This one here is for Arizona. And then we have this tool here, TACAMO, which is a database tool that you can use to as a first step in identifying potential vulnerabilities for forests and different ecosystem processes. So there are quite a few resources that can be utilized for this step. Another resource which we already have seen here in this presentation is the Tree Atlas. And for the Hiawatha National Forest, so what's in the table represents the data for the Hiawatha National Forest. We can look at, we've got a current condition here, and we've got the worst case scenario climate change output for the Hadley High column here on the right. And I've arranged these top 5 species in order of how they're going to lose in habitat. So this table represents importance values, and we can see sugar maple has a very high importance value in this forest on the Hiawatha at 12, and then the difference is a very negative number, minus 7.69. We can also see some additional species here on the bottom: red pine, yellow birch, eastern hemlock, and eastern white pine. If we were to go to the Ottawa National Forest, that's what these numbers here represent. We can see that the current importance value of sugar maple is even higher, and the negative impact climate change will have on its potential habitat is even greater. Then we can also look at the winners. So if we just reverse the table, we can see the species that are expected to fare better. So here we've got white oak, eastern red cedar, black oak, and these are arranged in order. Many of the species that are listed here do not currently grow on the Hiawatha National Forest. Northern red oak is one species that does, and so it's a species that could currently be promoted within our management. Another species we might consider is white ash. However, that species is undergoing changes due to emerald ash borer. So some of this information becomes very complex because you have to weigh lots of different factors in determining whether it's good to promote certain species. In the output of the Tree Atlas, you can also look at species range distributions by current distribution versus the output from the climate models. And here we have on the left sugar maple. So the hotter the color, the greater the importance value, or the greater the potential habitat. So with sugar maple, we can see that the colors are changing as we work down the page, which means the potential habitat for sugar maple will decrease in the northern tier. And then if we look at northern red oak, you can see a slight increase in the potential habitat, particularly in the Great Lakes region. Okay, so to summarize this step, assessing climate change impacts and vulnerabilities, in this region, we're expected to see warmer temperatures, alter precipitation regimes, increased potential for drought. Some species will fare worse and some will fare better, and we'll see an increase in pests and diseases. Okay, so the next step is number 3, evaluating management objectives given projected impacts and vulnerabilities. And here's where we might ask the question, are our desired future conditions reasonable given likely climate trajectories? So we're in a northern hardwood stand. Typical management involves using some kind of selection system silviculture, usually individual tree selection. Here I've got the perfect Q factor approach where we're trying to manage along this red line as our desired future condition. And this is very successful at managing for sugar maple sawtimber. But because our logging happens to occur mostly in the winter, there's very little scarification, and the gap sizes that are created from single tree selection are very small. It mostly promotes sugar maple regeneration, and this has resulted in mapleization and acerification, two very clever terms that other folks have coined to describe the species composition following long-term single tree selection management. Given what we know about the potential impacts of climate change on sugar maple habitat, here's where we might evaluate our objectives. The historic management objective was high quality sugar maple saw timber. The approach, uneven age, balanced age structure with a Q factor, short cutting cycle length. Maybe our contemporary management objective is to increase resiliency and to promote species diversity and complexity. And our approach might be to include alternative methods of silviculture that promote regeneration of mid-tolerant species and species that are expected to fare better in a future climate. That brings us to step number 4, identify adaptation approaches and tactics for implementation. So here's where we can use this FAR workbook. This is part of the process, and this other publication from the Western folks. And this is also where we invoke the silvicultural prescription process. So some examples for this particular forest type, if we want to enhance complexity in this forest, we may want to promote planting species that are currently underrepresented. In the top left, we've got an example of an aspen shelterwood with blister rust resistant eastern white pine planted underneath. And the aspen is oftentimes retained in the overstory, so this results in a much more complex structure into the future. Vernal pools. The red arrows in that picture are pointing to yellow birch and eastern hemlock trees, which are much more abundant surrounding vernal pools, these ephemeral bodies of water that are typically isolated within upland northern hardwood forests. And if we protect those vernal pools, we may also be protecting a seed source for the future, and also those species being represented on the landscape in a greater abundance. We've got eastern hemlock nurse logs for regeneration, and then the lower right picture, we've got a group selection with seed tree retention in what's typically been managed with this single tree selection northern hardwood system. So the idea here is this is a yellow birch tree that is maintained in the center of that gap with scarification surrounding that tree to promote regeneration of that underrepresented species. So the key here with implementing approaches is that business as usual isn't going to work, particularly in this system where sugar maple is the dominant species that's been regenerated with that system. We may want to enhance and maintain species and structural diversity within this forest type, and here are some examples then of ways that we might do that in northern hardwoods. And then the last step in this process is number 5, to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of our implemented actions, which is very similar to how we follow up with silvicultural treatments. Okay, the next steps. I've just got a few more slides to talk about a current project that we have in collaboration here at Michigan Tech and with the U.S. Forest Service. And this project is called Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change. And we've identified that forest managers are in dire need of robust examples demonstrating these adaptive management approaches, and they're in desperate need of on-the-ground examples. So we have a core team of folks working on this project. I'm the PI of the project here at Michigan Tech, and then we have Chris Swanston and Maria Janowiak from the Northern Research Station and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, also here in Houghton. And then Jim Goulden, who I think I saw sign in onto the webinar, is also a PI from the Southern Research Station. We've assembled this science committee team consisting of Brian Palick from the Northern Research Station, Linda Joyce from the Rocky Mountain, Connie Millar from the Pacific Southwest, and Dave Peterson from the Pacific Northwest. They represent our science committee, and they have been instrumental in helping guide the way we define our treatments and how we set up this study so that it's a scientifically and statistically robust study. We've also invoked the help of a statistician, Lisa Gagno, who has a lot of experience with designing large experimental designs, and so she's helping us stay honest and create a project that will be able to hopefully draw lots of conclusions and broad generalizations from. So the project has two main goals. The first one is to populate a multi-region study design with ecosystem-specific climate change adaptation treatments using input from an expert panel of regional scientists and local managers. So we'll be utilizing those folks from the previous slide, as well as local managers where we actually implement this study. So we want to do this at 3 to 5 different forest types across the United States. Our treatments are in the green box on the lower right. So we want to do a resistance and resilience treatment, a transition treatment, and then a no-action treatment. And these treatments, though we can settle on a common definition of what those treatments are, those treatments will look very different depending on the forest type that we're implementing them in. The primary objectives then are to compare these key variables listed here: forest growth and productivity, overstory and understory species composition, and forest health and tree vigor. And then we're anticipating additional variables that will be measured depending on each site. Our second goal is to introduce natural resource managers to conceptual tools and approaches, such as the one that I just outlined from the FAR workbook, that will help managers integrate climate change into natural resource management and silvicultural decision making. So our goal is to identify the national forest or the experimental forest where we want to implement each of these studies. We will travel there, conduct a workshop, leading those folks through that process, and then as part of that process, we'll be designing the experiments that will be implemented on the ground. So this is a way to train folks in that particular area as well. So in summary, future change is uncertain in severity, but certainly coming. We know that our climate is coming and it's changing. Impacts of the changing climate on forests, we've got the same old stresses, but they are going to be even worsened under climate change scenarios. Severity is affected by local conditions. So what happens here in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan is very different than what happens in other parts of the UP. Business as usual in terms of our silvicultural approaches isn't going to cut it. That's not going to help our ecosystems be more resilient to climate change. And so we need to incorporate climate change into our management approaches. The adaptive planning process that I outlined here will help us understand trends related to climate change, because it will force us to really look at the vulnerabilities of the ecosystems we're working in. And then we can translate this information into tactics, actual silvicultural prescriptions that can be implemented on the ground. If we continue to develop desired future conditions that are only based on historical benchmarks alone, this will cause some problems for us in the future. So we must really embrace the idea of future potential conditions when we're developing our desired conditions. Managing for complexity may also increase resiliency, so that's something we can start incorporating into our management. And adaptive management in general will help us attain the ultimate goal of sustaining ecosystem function. And that's my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention and participation, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have at this time.
Thank you, Linda. So at this time, folks, if you'd like to type your questions into the chat window, we will respond to them from there.
So Bob, do you want me to go ahead, Bob.
Okay. So here's one from Eric West. He's wondering if we can assume that the forests to the southeast will be least affected by this warming.
That's a good question, and I know there are some audience members who can address that much better than myself. I think that the changes will be different, and in some cases that's true that the southeast will see maybe more moderate changes than, say, the Great Lakes region. One reason the Great Lakes forests are of concern is because we have these transition zones between temperate and boreal forests, and we have all these very complicated interaction effects that are occurring. So the future of those forests is more unknown due to that tension zone. And you know, if someone from the southeast wants to chime in, I haven't looked as closely at the climate change projections for that area, but there's certainly going to be changes, but I think it's quite variable across the southeast.
Is there anybody here from the southeast that'd like to chime in on that?
Hey Linda, it's Jim Goulden. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, Jim.
The Southern Station is in the process of releasing its Southern Forest Futures Report, and I believe you can find a link to that on the station's website. There are going to be some significant effects across the South, and the effects vary to some degree depending on which of the climate change models comes into effect. For instance, in my part of the world, in Arkansas and Louisiana and Texas, we could see some as much as 10 to 20% less precipitation, whereas in other parts of the South we may have more precipitation. Certainly the greater that we have topographic variability, the greater the likelihood of difficulties, so for instance in the Appalachians. But it's very much a changing picture at this point.
Great, thanks, Jim.
So, folks, I know several of you typed in asking for where you can get a copy of the presentation. The presentation is available on forestrywebinars.net. That was the portal page that you came in on. And we've also just posted the links to the two publications that Linda was referring to from the Pacific Northwest and from the Northeast, as well as a link to the Tamako webinar we held several months ago, and a projection website that one of you had posted up from the Northeast. So Linda, another question comes up is, how do you account for uncertainty in climate change projections?
How do we account for uncertainty in climate change projections? One way is by looking at the range of conditions. So we can develop strategies that somehow fit in the middle. So we know the minimum change is very likely to occur and the maximum change may or may not occur. So if we work somewhere in the middle, I had one diagram there. I just read through some of the comments. Maybe it slipped through too quickly, but there was a diagram that showed a large spread. So just like with any model output, sometimes the absolute value is a little dangerous to really hang your hat on, so we might want to look at more of a range of potential futures and work within that range.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, can you explain how this process will not encourage or accelerate species change?
The process, I'm assuming the author of the question is talking about the process of adaptive management and the notion of increasing complexity. I think one good strategy here is, I've heard it described as no regrets decisions. So we do need to be very careful about the way we intentionally are trying to shift ecosystems. And we want to be deliberate about choosing species that maybe already exist and are projected to do better in the future, and if there are good reasons for enhancing those species, then that would be a sound management decision. But maybe we don't want to enhance certain species because of other concerns, such as forest health concerns. So it is a very complex question. the idea of seed zones comes to mind, and whether or not we can start dipping into southern seed zones from the area you're working in to try to enhance those species. And that might be an option. I know there are restrictions to dipping outside of designated seed zones, but the notion of planting species that don't already exist, that might be something that is something that needs much more consideration. So yes, a lot of these strategies might enhance species compositional changes. Sometimes that's a really positive way or really sound way to get at our desired future conditions.
Okay, next question is, what about extremes? While the climate change graphs show relative smooth curves, extremes are also more likely.
Absolutely true. And the hardest part about extremes is that they're very, very difficult to model. So that's an excellent point. The only thing I guess I would say in direct response to that is that if we try to promote resiliency within our forests, hopefully we're creating healthy, vigorous forests that will be at their biggest capacity to accommodate those extreme events. But we certainly can't control the climate, and we can see in recent history how extreme weather events are increasing. So that's a really excellent point, and one that needs to be, people are talking about how do we accommodate these extreme events, and that is one way to look at how we develop our management strategies.
Randy Fuller's interested in knowing if you are working with any Native American forests.
Hi, Randy. We are still hoping to do that. Where we put in these studies, for instance, with the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project, we are still hoping to have some tribal or BIA partners. We're getting on the ground and moving forward with our first site in northern Minnesota on the Hiawatha National Forest, so we're hopeful that we'll get that site in place, and there's possibilities there to expand out to tribal land. And yes, increasingly with the broader work that we're doing here at Michigan Tech and the folks here in the Northern Research Station, we're trying to include tribal partners in the work that we're doing. So hopefully you'll see an increase in that in the future.
All right, thank you. Al Tullis, sorry Al if I mispronounced your last name, is wondering if there's any process to distribute this information to the manufacturing facilities in the areas about changing their processes.
That's a good idea. Not one that I have personally thought about, and I'm not sure that that notion has been in people's minds in the circle of folks that I've been working with. If anyone else has a comment, I'd welcome that. That's a very good point.
So Steve Wood has made the comment, sounds like we're recommending single tree selection in an earlier slide to increase diversity. Would think you would want varied treatments to regenerate, grow species of various tolerances.
Yes, that's actually correct. So I hope I didn't mislead folks into thinking that single tree selection is promoting species diversity, because that's actually the point I was trying to make. With the work that we've done here at Michigan Tech, looking at a fairly large area of single tree selection, silviculture in northern hardwoods, what we found is that it really reduces species diversity, especially in the seedling and sapling layers. And so with our changing objectives, that process or that approach is not achieving the goal of enhancing species diversity. Very successful at other timber-related goals, but not successful at creating diverse structures. And there's also debate about with single tree selection or uneven age management, we do create somewhat structurally complex stands, but if that's done across a very wide and broad landscape, that's actually reducing landscape level diversity. So diversifying our silvicultural approaches in general will help us achieve notions of resiliency and complexity.
Okay, here's a comment on perhaps we need to begin a discussion relative to the Endangered Species Act in the context of a changing climate. Perhaps it is not suitable as conceptualized and often implemented.
Well, I would agree with that comment. You know, an example is the Kirtland warbler and jack pine forest here in the Great Lakes region, and I agree with you completely about how we approach restoration for single species, and asking the question, is that compatible with how we need to face climate change? So, excellent point.
One on forest certification schemes. They're wondering, is forest certification schemes, especially FSC, rely heavily on historic conditions as a benchmark for future management. How useful might a system of representative reference areas managed to maintain the current range of ecological conditions be in observing or responding to climate change?
So the question is, how useful would those example treatments be?
Yes, I believe that's what it is.
Well, I think that they're very useful. If the question is in the context of how FSC operates, I still think that's very useful for folks to understand the responses to those different treatments given objectives of accommodating climate change. So I may not be fully understanding the question, but I think the more examples we have of adaptive management on the ground, the more we're going to see shifts in you know, standards for certification and other guiding principles that we use in forest management.
Thank you. Question is,